Trump threatens 35% tariffs on Canadian goods not covered by USMCA. The Economic Times. Ottawa shifts quietly, diversifying exports to Europe, Asia, and the UK. Reuters. On August 1st, Donald Trump made good on his threat, slapping a 35% tariff on Canadian imports outside the USMCA framework, citing fentanyl trafficking as the justification. It was a bold move designed to corner Canada back to the negotiating table. But instead of retaliating, Canada adjusted, swiftly, calmly, and strategically. Exports to the U.S. dropped to their lowest share since 2020. So the question now isn't who shouted loudest, but rather who just walked away stronger. For decades, the United States and Canada enjoyed one of the most stable and productive trade relationships in the world. Bound by geography, history, and aligned democratic values, the two nations became each other's largest trading partners under the framework of NAFTA and later the USMCA. By 2024, more than 75% of Canadian exports were headed straight to the U.S., fueling industries on both sides of the border. This partnership wasn't just about numbers. It was about trust, a cross-border handshake that kept auto factories humming in Ontario, fed oil pipelines from Alberta to Texas, and delivered lumber, grain, and minerals where they were needed most. The phrase trusted trade partner wasn't diplomatic fluff. It was reality. But no alliance is immune to pressure. In 2018, during Trump's first term, cracks had already begun to show with Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. Though those were eventually lifted, they left a bitter aftertaste in Ottawa. Then came a new era of unilateralism. In 2025, Trump returned with a sharpened tone. He accused Canada of failing to stop the flow of fentanyl precursors entering the U.S., threatening sweeping tariffs. While the issue of fentanyl was real, using it as a trade cudgel marked a dramatic escalation. The problem wasn't just economic, it was philosophical. Washington began treating trade not as a cooperative mechanism, but as a weapon of leverage. Meanwhile, Canada began questioning whether proximity still meant partnership. As August 1st loomed, it became clear the era of quiet harmony was over, and in its place was something colder, more tactical, a calculated economic standoff in the making. On July 10, 2025, Donald Trump made it official. If Canada refused to renegotiate the terms of their trade relationship by August 1st, a sweeping 35% tariff would be imposed on all Canadian goods not covered by USMCA. The message was unmistakable. In a fiery Rose Garden address, Trump accused the Canadian government of doing nothing to stop the fentanyl crisis and labeled them a complacent neighbor. This is not a negotiation, Trump said. This is national security. At the heart of this strategy was Section 232, a provision in the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, originally designed to protect American industries from foreign threats during wartime. Trump's administration had previously invoked it to justify tariffs on steel and aluminum from close allies, including Canada, Mexico, and the EU. This time, the rationale was even more tenuous. Trump claimed that precursors used to make fentanyl were entering the U.S. via Canada's ports, even though law enforcement agencies had not publicly cited Canada as a primary source. But the narrative wasn't about facts. It was about optics, strongman diplomacy on the world stage. Trump framed the move as a final warning to Canada, signaling that the U.S. would no longer tolerate what he called diplomatic freeloading. He painted Canada not as a longtime ally, but as a liability, a nation allegedly prioritizing its trade benefits over U.S. domestic safety. White House officials, including Trade Representative Ann Becker, reiterated the stance in interviews. If Canada wants the benefits of American markets, they must act like a responsible partner, she said on Fox Business. This is about leverage. But underneath the bravado, the logic was riddled with contradictions. For one, USMCA was already a legally binding framework, negotiated and ratified with bipartisan support. Nearly 90 to 95% of Canadian exports were still protected under its provisions, but Trump's order surgically targeted the remaining 5 to 10%, a symbolic strike, but one with strategic economic consequences. Industries hit hardest included steel, aluminum, auto parts, and agricultural products, all of which play critical roles in U.S. supply chains. Critics called it economic blackmail. Trump called it strategic decoupling. The administration's gamble was simple. Under immense tariff pressure, Canada would come crawling back to the table before August 1st, ready to sign a new bilateral deal, one that gave the U.S. even greater control over cross-border trade terms. But there was one thing the White House hadn't considered. What if Canada didn't crawl? While Washington turned up the volume, Ottawa lowered it. Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't issue an angry press release. There were no sanctions, no matching tariffs, no media blitz. Instead, Canada executed a plan already years in the making, and that might be what truly caught Washington off guard. In May 2025, Canadian export data showed a remarkable shift. For the first time since 2020, less than 70% of Canada's exports were headed to the U.S. The number had dropped from a 2024 average of 75.9% to just 68.3%. It was the clearest signal yet. Canada was weaning itself off its long-standing economic dependency on its southern neighbor. The strategy wasn't reactive, it was preemptive. Under Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, Canada had quietly accelerated negotiations with the EU, UK, and key Indo-Pacific nations over the past 2 years. With the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CTA, with Europe already in place, and new bilateral accords with Australia and Japan moving forward, Canadian exporters had begun to reorient their supply chains. Grain, once destined for Minneapolis, was now heading to Rotterdam. Auto parts built in Ontario were shipping to Munich instead of Detroit. Instead of confronting Trump's threat head-on, Canada made it obsolete. Canadian officials refused to attend emergency meetings proposed by the U.S. trade team, instead reiterating that any discussion would happen during the scheduled USMCA review in 2026. "We will not be bullied into a side deal," Carney said. "Canada does not reward intimidation." Behind the scenes, this approach wasn't without cost. Several Canadian industries, especially those still dependent on U.S. buyers, were facing disruptions. But Ottawa offered support packages, logistical incentives for exporters diversifying routes, and fast-tracked regulatory approvals for new international partnerships. The Canadian response was understated but powerful. Where the U.S. sought spectacle, Canada sought structure. Where the U.S. demanded headlines, Canada worked toward hard numbers. And the numbers told the story: a 7.7 billion Canadian dollar decline in exports to the U.S. over 12 months, partially offset by gains in Europe and Asia. For Canadian leaders, this wasn't just a trade dispute, it was a wake-up call, and perhaps even an opportunity to reshape the nation's long-term economic blueprint. The silent shift was happening, and Washington was still yelling at a closing door. As August 1st came and went, no new deal was signed. The 35% tariffs went into effect on Canadian goods outside the USMCA, but Ottawa didn't blink. The U.S. imposed its will. Canada sidestepped it. Now both sides are stuck in a strange diplomatic limbo. Trump's strategy failed to force capitulation, yet Canada's economy, while resilient, is absorbing painful shocks. Some Canadian businesses are still too dependent on U.S. buyers to pivot overnight. Meanwhile, American importers are already seeing price spikes for Canadian raw materials, including aluminum and lumber. USMCA remains intact, technically, but in practice it's been gutted by distrust and a new atmosphere of coercion. The scheduled 2026 review now looms larger than ever. It's no longer just a bureaucratic checkup. It's become the battlefield for redefining trade itself. Neither side wants to appear weak, yet both are bleeding quietly. What was once the gold standard of continental trade has now become a warning. When politics trumps partnership, everyone pays. And as the cameras fade and the tariffs stay, one thing becomes chillingly clear: this isn't over. In the industrial heartland of Ontario, the town of Sarnia tells a quiet but revealing story. Known for its petrochemical plants and metal fabrication hubs, Sarnia has long depended on cross-border trade with Michigan. But since the 35% tariffs kicked in, companies like Blue Point Steelworks, a mid-sized manufacturer of alloy components, have seen their orders from the U.S. dry up almost overnight. "We had contracts with a client in Ohio for over 10 years, said CEO Margaret Doyle. By mid-August, they paused all new orders. The tariff made our prices uncompetitive. Full stop. Blue Point isn't alone. According to industry figures from Manufacturers and Exporters Canada, roughly 14% of small to mid-sized exporters reported direct contract losses by the end of August 2025. In British Columbia, lumber exporters faced shipment delays and renegotiated pricing structures. In Saskatchewan, pulse farmers saw American buyers shift to alternate suppliers in Brazil and India. The government in Ottawa responded swiftly. A $2.5 billion transition fund was announced in early September to support businesses in reorienting their export logistics, including subsidies for shipping to the EU and Indo-Pacific, accelerated customs clearance training, and digital compliance services. Yet the broader anxiety remains. For businesses heavily integrated with the U.S. supply chain, realignment isn't a switch, it's a slog. Meanwhile, the cultural cost is harder to quantify. There's a sense of betrayal, said Janelle Martin, a trade policy analyst based in Toronto. For decades, we were told this partnership was special, and now we're treated like a threat. But perhaps the clearest cost is the redefinition of identity. For the first time in modern history, Canada is deliberately stepping away from its reliance on the U.S., not in rebellion, but in self-preservation. The damage is real, but so is the determination to evolve. Just across the border, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Midwest Tool and Foundry has started feeling the heat. "We source precision steel components from Canada," said Operations Manager Carl Reynolds. "They were affordable, high quality, and delivered fast. Now, with a 35% markup, we're hunting for alternatives, and fast. That search isn't going well. Domestic suppliers can't match the cost or scale. Overseas vendors in South Korea and Turkey come with longer lead times, language barriers, and complex logistics. As a result, Midwest has delayed 2 major contracts and furloughed 24 workers. And that's just one example. In a recent report by the American Chamber of Commerce, nearly 1 in 5 manufacturing firms in northern states reported serious disruptions in cross-border supply chains by September 2025. Industries like construction, auto manufacturing, and even consumer electronics were all affected. Retailers, too, are caught in the crossfire. Home improvement chains in Wisconsin and Minnesota have seen price increases on Canadian lumber and drywall. Small businesses that relied on affordable imports, everything from fertilizers to aluminum cans, are now grappling with higher input costs. The most ironic twist? Trump's tariffs, justified under the guise of combating fentanyl, haven't meaningfully curbed the crisis. According to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the majority of synthetic opioids still enter the country through southern land ports or via international mail, not from Canadian routes. In effect, the economic pain is real. The justification, increasingly questionable. "It's like amputating your hand to cure a headache," said supply chain analyst Fiona Vasquez. "The policy creates more disruption than it prevents." For everyday Americans, the impact isn't just about geopolitics, it's about rising prices, delayed projects, and fewer paychecks. And for all the rhetoric about winning the trade war, many are beginning to ask, what exactly did we win? 2 nations, 1 border, and now a widening gap. The U.S. sees tariffs as leverage. Canada sees them as betrayal. Trump escalated to 35%, hoping to force a deal. Canada responded not with rage, but with redirection, recalibrating its trade maps while quietly walking away from dependency. Now, both countries sit at a fragile impasse. The economic wounds are fresh, the political scars deeper, and the USMCA still alive, but more as a legal formality than a living partnership. The real question isn't just what comes next, it's what gets rebuilt and what gets left behind. Will North America find its way back to trust, or has this fracture become permanent? If you found this story eye-opening, hit like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more sharp, untold stories from both sides of the border.